Hello, apes, and welcome to screencast number 2 in the Chapter 3 series. And today we're looking at natural selection and how it shapes organisms and diversity. And I forgot to tell you the title of the chapter, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. So I have a great movie on Darwin. Unfortunately, we don't have a way to play it because it's on VHS, but it's very interesting about Darwin, and he wasn't really a confident scientist, and his confidence was lacking due to what was happening with Christianity during the 1800s, and Christianity. And I don't say this in a bad way, but they ruled everything. They ruled over science. So for him to be able to present his idea of evolution, that organisms evolve and change, that was something that was really testing the waters and tempting a lot of discontent on him because it's something that the church would have said, no, it was totally against. And Darwin kept finding things. He set sail on the HMS Beagle when he was about 22 years old, and his job was to chart South America and America. They were going to be mapping, and he just started to collect some organisms, and he noticed as he was collecting the organisms that there were organisms that were related to each other but different, and he wanted to know why. And for example, he found large skeletal remains of an armadillo. And when I say large, it was about 3 feet in size. And today's armadillos, the ones that we're familiar with, that he's familiar with, they barely get over a foot in size, and this was huge. And he knew that there was some kind of change that took place. So he started to study. He did a lot of work with barnacles. He started to study organisms. He started to make comparisons. One of the places that he went to was the Galapagos Islands and the finches. He noticed that there was variations within the beaks of the finches, and he knew that they related somehow, but they had changed. And why had they changed? In 1858, Darwin and another man by the name of Wallace both proposed the idea of natural selection as a mechanism of evolution. Darwin happened to beat Wallace to the publication, and that's why Darwin gets most of the credit. So the idea of natural selection is that organisms struggle to survive and reproduce in their environment. So that struggle produces offspring that are able to survive, because the ones that can survive and reproduce are going to be the strongest within the population. Another premise of natural selection is that individuals of species will vary in their characteristics due to the genes and the environment. So when they looked at the birds on the Galapagos Islands, they did vary in their characteristic, and those characteristics then actually had changes or alterations that happened within the genetic makeup that they were able to pass that on to their offspring. And he believed it was caused by the environment, because at one point he thought with plate tectonics that those islands were all joined together, and then because of the shifting, because of some major event, they got separated, and the birds that would normally feed on one thing that was no longer on the island now had to adapt and survive and develop new beaks in order to be able to eat and survive, that they were able to pass on. Some individuals are better suited to their environment, and they reproduce more effectively. So again, the idea of the survival of the fittest. And organisms with better adapted traits will produce more offspring and will pass those traits on to the offspring. So you heard me mention the term adaptation. And the definition of this, as you can see here, is the process where over time characteristics or traits that lead to better reproductive success become more prevalent in a population. We used to be really short as a species. We're getting taller, and we're passing that height on because we're getting better nutrition, better medicine. We're more active than what we were. Well, we're not more active than what we were, but we're doing outside things because we can tolerate now the cold with the way that we heat, and we're getting bigger, we're getting taller. Adaptive trait or adaptation is a trait that promotes reproductive success. So if we have a trait that enables a species to survive, that trait is going to be passed on and make that species successful. Now, there are mutations that can occur, and some of these adaptive traits happen as a result of mutations. I think we have a tendency to see mutations as bad, but there's favorable mutations where these are accidental changes in the DNA that may be passed on to the next generation. There's a variety of mutations. As I said, there's ones that are bad, that cause birth defects. There's ones that we call non-lethal because they provide the genetic variation on the basis that natural selection is going to work. There's a species of mice that live on the lava flats, and these mice are black in color. And lava flats are black. So what had happened was gray mice, which we tend to think are the most, gray or brown mice, they were the ones that were prevalent, but somehow a black mice or two was produced, and they could not be seen by predators as much as the gray and the brown on these lava flats. So they got taken out by the predators. And that black trait then just started to be passed on. So this is what can happen. Sexual reproduction is also going to lead to that variation, because you can have a black mouse mate with a gray mouse. You could have a gray mouse mate with a brown mouse. So that's going to pass that variation on. So there's something that we need to reference, and that is directional selection. And you probably haven't heard of this before. This might be something new to your science curriculum and what we're covering in environmental science. And directional selection is something that drives a feature in one direction. So let's see what that means. So when we think about sexual reproduction going on, what we know is that the organisms are going to get a portion of each of their parents' genes, and that's going to contribute to the genes of that particular offspring. So this process is going to produce combinations of genes that generate variation among the individuals from one generation to the next. But as we're seeing with directional selection, when natural selection acts on genetic variation by favoring certain variants, it can actually drive a feature in a particular direction. Because it's an evolutionary change, it generally requires a great deal of time, so it's not going to be something that happens right away. And a species cannot always adapt to the environment conditions that change quickly. So it's going to change it in a direction where it can meet those requirements in order to be able to survive. So here's an example. When we had warming of our global climate that's happening today, it's really occurring too rapidly for most species to adapt, and we're looking at the possibility of facing many species to extinction as a result. So this temperature change is happening really quick, and we can tell that by our geological history that's happening. Genetic variation, though, can sometimes help protect the population against these changes, as, for example, the honeykeepers that we were talking about. In recent years, they've discovered that they're living in the ohia trees at very low elevations, well within the zone where the avian malaria had killed off the other honey creepers. And researchers are saying that these Ackies are living there and thriving by chance because of building a natural resistance to the disease, something that they were forced in that direction in order to survive. Does that make sense, I hope, to everybody? Okay, so here's those here's Darwin's finches. No, these aren't Darwin's finches. These are the honey creepers that we were talking about earlier. I think the next picture might be Darwin's finches. Okay, so these are the honey creepers, and we can see the differences in the beaks that they have here. And when we look at the original population, the shape of the beaks were like this. The number of individuals peaked, and then they started to go down. Where here, the short beaks, they peaked earlier and went down lower, and then the long beaks wound up peaking later and then going down in their numbers. So selective pressures from the environment are going to influence that adaptation. Related species in different environments are going to experience different pressures, and because of that, they're going to evolve different traits. So going back to Darwin's finches, which I was hoping there was a picture, but there actually is not. Darwin's finches, because they lived on different islands, they experienced different pressures in order to obtain food. Some needed to eat insects, so they needed a flatter beak to squash those insects. Some needed to develop a more pointed beak so that they could get nectar from flowers. Others needed to develop a hooked beak so that they could pick out dead logs to be able to get insects out, much the same as the honey creepers did. So we refer to this as convergent evolution. And this is where unrelated species may acquire similar traits because they live in similar environments. So we've got our finches versus our honey creepers. They're unrelated, but their beaks are changing because they live in similar environments. All right, does that make sense? I hope so. So here is divergent evolution of the honey creepers, and we can see their beaks have developed for eating fruit. These are the nectarivores, which means that they're going to get nectar, and their beaks are specific for that. These are the generalists. That means they can usually go back and forth. Foragers, notice the difference in the foragers, and then the bark pickers that you can see here. And here's an idea of a convergent evolution between cactus in Arizona. So here's a cactus in Arizona, and then here's a similar cactus in the Canary Islands. Okay, so you can see that they're very, very similar in the type of cactus that they are, but they're both growing in two different areas, and they're two different species of cacti. All right, we're going to end this here, and we will start the artificial selection in the next screencast.